They found the bones by accident, the way a bad story sometimes finds its ending, by a board splitting under a careless boot. Workmen prying up the warped floor of an abandoned church in the forests north of Albany uncovered the first grave in the summer of 1862. By day's end, they had counted 3. By the week's end, the count stood at 143, each skull and rib cage inscribed with a ledger of pain. Fractures mended crooked, grooves scored into femurs. The telltale lesions of drowning repeated and survived, as if breath itself had been trained to turn back midway up the throat. Local officials covered their mouths and wrote what they could bear to write. Federal men took the rest and locked it away. I was not meant to see what lay in those government boxes, but the country keeps poor secrets, and the dead insist upon witnesses. The files that found their way into my hands were brittle with time and damp with the old sweat of the men who had touched them. They spoke of a settlement named Ravenwood, quiet as snow and ordinary as a ledger entry, and of 3 brothers who arrived there in the summer of 1825, speaking softly about purification and the higher uses of suffering. Elder Ezra, who had a voice like a gold-edged blade and the eyes of a man pleased to be obeyed. Deacon Silas, scholar thin, ink-stained with the serene patience of a spider. Prophet Caleb, the youngest, all tremor and light, his whispers swelling inexplicably to fill a room, his pupils rolling heavenward as if his skull were a dome and angels circled beneath it. They built their church from the local stone, black and heavy in a shape that defied habit, an octagon around a dark full heart. No windows pierced the sanctuary. Light came in measured rations from lanterns placed as precisely as the points on a compass. I have stared at the old plan drawings and wondered how many decisions along the way were simple economy and how many were made with a hand already guided by cruelty. The brothers preached a doctrine that felt, at first, tasting, familiar to that decade's gnawing hunger for new revelations. One must burn to be clean, they said. One must hunger to be fed. One must be drowned to be born. The book was full of such metaphors, and they did not pretend otherwise. They only corrected the tone and insistence. These things were not images. They were instructions, and in those pews sat the crushed and the aimless and the wealthy who had tired of being comforted, all of them primed by the burned-over district's revivals to expect fire at last to touch their lives. It did. They sorted the hopeful with a practiced hand. Prophet Caleb held interviews that resembled confessions, except that the penitent learned nothing of absolution and everything about how his sorrow might be made useful. The brothers called their chosen the vessels of the Spirit, a phrase like a caress, a sentence like a door that locks from the outside. What began with fasting and cold vigil ended, in the winter of 1829, with a ceremony the brothers later named the First Ascension. There are 2 accounts from within that night that can be trusted, and both are written by men who trembled as they wrote. They describe a sanctuary cut deeper than a well, 12 candles nested in the grooves of a great spiral incised into the floor, and 3 congregants led forward as if to a wedding. Sarah, Michael, Rebecca, new converts clean of entangling kin. The brothers explained the meaning of inversion and then made a symbol of the human body. They administered air and earth and fire and water in their cruel varieties. The congregation chanted until language detached from meaning and became only a bridge from one minute to the next. Near dawn, the 3 hung limp but alive. By sunrise, they were speaking a language no one present had learned. And then they were not speaking at all. If you ask how a room full of ordinary people watched and did not rise up, you ask a good question late. The brothers had tuned their flock across a subtle gradient of pain and reward until the room itself sang in their key. The witnesses fled in handfuls, and those who stayed surrendered the last defenses of their doubt. Death inside the church became a sacrament. A murdered body became a proof. Beneath the stone, the brothers expanded a second church that did not trouble to feign piety. Chambers honeycombed outward, preparation, trials, ascension, saints. The last held what the ledgers call relics, bodies open to the uses of science, bones cleaned to an ivory grammar and wired upright into prayers. Deacon Silas's notes, which I have touched through 2 layers of cotton glove, name chemicals and instruments with a calm that burns the eye. The preservation grew finer as the years passed. The pain more efficient. The record-keeping meticulous enough that a mind like his might have mistaken it for righteousness. The congregation swelled. Donations flowed. The church added a school, dormitories, workshops that sold respectable goods stamped with discreet sigils, It entertained visiting ministers and donated to orphanages. In the catacombs, the brothers refined what they called elevations and what the coroners would later call a pattern of homicide with no modern equal. When the graves beneath the floorboards were counted a decade after the trials, they exceeded 400. The official figure at the time of the arrests was lower. Official figures in matters like these usually are. The church would have gone on indefinitely if madness, timely madness, had not split their order from the inside. Prophet Caleb, eaten by visions and the rising tally of his own whispers, escaped his restraints in June of 1851 and reeled naked into the Ravenwood Square, his flesh cross-hatched with self-made cuts, his mind an open reliquary. He shouted the secrets out loud, and the town, which had not known itself complicit, was forced to learn what its silence had bought. Men carried him away and locked him in a quiet room where he drew maps that would stand up in court. Elder Ezra, learning of the breach, lit a careful fire. The main entrance to the tunnels collapsed in the heat. Underground, they uncapped a stream and let it drown the evidence. When federal men arrived, the congregation was shoveling ash with the tidy grief of people who deserve sympathy. Ezra spoke well. He always had. God had tried them twice, he said. Once by afflicting the brother he loved, and again by allowing sacred place to burn. He opened his hands to the search with the serenity of a man certain he had already fed the worst of it to the river. Fire never learns to eat everything. The investigators found what the water had not reached. The Chamber of Saints received their lanterns with the patient politeness of a museum. Posed bodies, children-sized restraints, implements that remembered heat. They pried up a floorboard in Silas's room and took from it a ledger that named the dead and priced the ones sold to medical colleges. A phrase I write and then must set the pen down to consider anew, because it means precisely what you suspect it means. In that half-lawless era when anatomy outran ethics, the churches of learning were hungry for cadavers, and men like Silas learned how to feed them. The trial opened in January of 1852 and drew crowds who preferred their horror framed in walnut and law. Survivors spoke. Doctors pointed to patterns, fractures healed, lungs scarred from drownings, burns laid out in deliberate geometries, the chemistry of agonies prolonged. The defense, cornered by facts, tried to argue for the sanctuary of belief. The Constitution, they said, did not exist to protect only the comfortable. Ezra took the stand against counsel and performed his last and finest sermon, admitting all, regretting nothing, elegantly stitching mysticism to a ruthless idea of progress. Pain, he said, was the purest solvent of the self. Death was only a corridor. Their victims had walked bravely for the sake of understanding. He called the children pure vessels, and the room groaned as if a ship's spine had cracked. Guilty on all counts. The sentence fixed the date for their hanging, and then the jail burned, the way stories like this contrive a gap through which evil can depart. A body the guards called Silas lay blackened and ringed, easy to identify if a man wished to be fooled. Ezra was gone. The hunt spiraled outward and snagged at rumor. In Baltimore, a cooperating physician was found in a posture the church had made famous, a note pinned to his chest in a hand still steady with conviction. 2 more deaths followed. The new century would collect a box of journals at Harvard, anonymous and ironclad, the last entries in Ezra's script or an imitation very close to it. The government sealed them. The government later unsealed them for scholars whose sleep grew thinner thereafter. The site at Ravenwood stayed empty, fenced with official warnings. Hemmed with stories the locals do not tell their children until the children first ask. It would be a misuse of your patience to set down every witness and every receipt. What matters is the machine the brothers built and the lessons it teaches, which are not new and never stale. Charisma is a solvent. Ritual is an engine. The human wish to make suffering meaningful is a door with hinges worn smooth. Give these a doctrine and a ledger and a place underground, and you can teach ordinary people to watch a neighbor die and call it courage. Add, as Silas did, a university address and the fragrance of learning, and you will recruit allies whose collars and consciences are equally white. The burned-over district had taught the public to expect tongues of flame. The brothers offered fire and insisted you stand closer. There are small mercies. A postal inspector named Thornhill paid attention to numbers that didn't add up. A physician in Albany decided a body told the truth even when the note attached to it lied. A frightened accountant fled with his memory and his courage intact. A madman drew a map. These are not the triumphs we like to print on posters, and they did not prevent the last killings, but they bent the story away from a clean, invisible conclusion and forced daylight into the place where daylight is least welcome. When I drove to Ravenwood in late autumn and stood at the fence, the perimeter signs bleached to a tired yellow, I tried to decide what the land remembered. The wind traveled the hollow like water poured down a stair. A gap in the trees gave me a view of the shallow depression where the octagon had sat, and there was nothing there that would demand your terror if you did not bring it with you. Crows crossed and recrossed the clearing as if measuring it. Somewhere far off, a chain clanked and was silent. I could pretend to tell you I felt a thing graze the back of my neck, but that would be a lie unworthy of the truth that already exists. The earth will take anything, body after body, secret after secret, and in time, the grass will fill the seams, and the young will pose for photographs and laugh about the stories. That is not the horror. The horror is that what the brothers did can be done in any century that forgets to be ashamed. In the papers I read, stored beneath the federal stamp like insects under glass, you can see how the law learned to write the word ethics in a darker ink. In 1855, the physicians gathered and agreed to pretend, at least, to a better discipline. States wrote statutes that demanded proof you had the right to touch the dead. These are not cures. They are stitches. They pull edges closer and leave a seam. The scar is what you can trace with your thumb when you start to forget where the wound was. People ask whether Elder Ezra survived to dot his last line at the turn of the century, an old man with a hand that shook at last. The more interesting question is not whether he died in a foreign boarding house or in a farmhouse along some quiet road, but whether his sentences took root in soil much softer than Ravenwood's. Hospitals where progress pads down the hall on quiet feet. Churches where certainty tastes sweet. Clubs where wealthy men nod at talk of the necessary cost. There are little groups even now that borrow words from the Ravencroft Catechism without knowing their source. There are experiments that do not use the word suffering for what they inflict. They are careful. They have windows. They keep excellent records. On my last night with the archive, I unfolded a page that had been tucked, perhaps intentionally, where a clerk's eye would skip it. It was a letter without salutation, the script a cousin to Silas's, the language unusually plain. We sought a door and found men who would open it for us. We named the door God, and then we named it Science. In truth, it was only the human throat. We learned how to close it slowly. We listened to what came out. I placed the letter back where it had slept for a century and washed my hands twice. If the bones under that church could speak, they would not describe monsters. They would describe a mood, a room, a hush, the first small surrender, how the mind learns to translate a neighbor's scream into a hymn. They would tell you that the instruments were clean and the lanterns steady, that the men who held them were certain and calm. They would tell you that certainty, not darkness, is the thing to fear. And if you are tempted to ask whether everything about the brothers is now known, consider how well a steeple hides a stair and how the human heart can be taught to climb it smiling.